Every way we count time starts from a single event, the birth of Jesus. It is year one, the starting point for the calendar we use every day on our phones, computers, and planners. This idea seems as solid as a rock. It is the foundation of our history, a fact that everyone learns and accepts without question. However, this solid foundation might actually be made of sand. Our starting point, year one, carries signs of a major calculation error, a flaw that hides a hole of at least 10 years in our timeline. We have become accustomed to trusting tradition. Tradition is often just a story, a narrative retold so many times that it eventually gained the appearance of truth. We need to turn off the autopilot of tradition and switch on the cold, relentless logic of data. We fed the artificial intelligence Numa with all available historical documents from that era: sacred texts, Roman tax records, historians' chronicles, and astronomical maps. The mission was simple: find the exact birth date of the man known as Jesus. It seemed like a straightforward task. We have two primary sources describing the event: the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke. We asked Numa to synchronize these two narratives with the real timeline of documented history. It was at that moment the system issued a critical alert, a temporal paradox that history classes could never resolve. Numa detected a fissure in the fabric of time, an abyss at least 10 years wide. The first witness is Matthew. His text states, without a doubt, that Jesus was born in the days of King Herod, the same Herod the Great, a tyrant, but also a brilliant builder. For the story of the Magi and the massacre to be real, Herod needed to be alive. This is a historical anchor. We entered the question into Numa: when did Herod die? The system searched the works of historian Flavius Josephus and, decisively, the field of astronomy. Josephus writes that Herod died shortly after a lunar eclipse and before the Jewish Passover. Numa modeled the skies and identified the date. It was a partial lunar eclipse visible in Judea on the night of March 12th to 1304 BC. If Jesus was born during Herod's lifetime, his birth could not have happened in year one. It would have had to occur, at the very least, in the year 5 or even 7 BC. The chronological problem worsens with the second witness, the evangelist Luke. He gives us another precise reference. The birth occurred during the first census, when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Numa scanned Roman records. Quirinius only became governor of Syria in 6 AD, not a day before. It was at that moment that Judea passed into the direct control of Rome, and Quirinius arrived to take an inventory of the new subject's assets. This was the census. This contradiction has no simple solution. According to Matthew, Jesus was born before March 4th BC. According to Luke, he was born during a census that began no earlier than 6 AD. Between the death of Herod and the government of Quirinius, there is a 10-year abyss, 10 years of emptiness. Jesus could not have been born in both periods. Either he was born under Herod, but Quirinius's census did not exist, or he was born during the census, but Herod had already been dead for a decade. The probability of these two events coinciding is 0. This leads us to the origin of the date we use today. Numa takes us to the 6th century, to a monk named Dionysius Exiguus. He was tasked with creating a new system to calculate the date of Easter and decided to create a new era based on the incarnation of our Lord. His calculations, however, contained fatal errors. He forgot to include year 0 and got confused by the complex regnal years of Emperor Augustus. The result was a calculation error of at least 4 to 7 years. By Dionysius's count, Herod died 3 years before the birth of the man he supposedly tried to assassinate, an absurdity that, by historical irony, became the global standard. The official date we use is a fiction. An error in this date changes the entire context. The very environment where history began. The narrative we know is wrapped in a late construction. Beneath this layer, there is a historical core. If we cannot trust the calendar or the census, one last independent marker remains. An event Matthew mentions that cannot be invented because thousands of people saw it. An astronomical phenomenon, a star. If we can identify this object in the sky of the past, we will have the absolute date, not the one a monk calculated, but the one written in the movement of the planets. If you ask anyone what the greatest symbol of Christmas is, the answer almost always points to the top of the tree, the shining, imposing star, a divine beacon. In Matthew's account, it was this celestial object that served as a guide for the wise men from the east, leading them thousands of kilometers to Judea. The story is poetic. A star that moves, guides a caravan, and finally stops over the exact place where the child was. From the point of view of physics, this is impossible. Stars are giant suns light years away. They do not travel through our atmosphere to hover over a roof. If a real star came close enough to Earth to point out a house, it would incinerate the planet. So, was it just a myth? A beautiful metaphor to give the event a cosmic scale? Many stop there. However, we do not seek miracles. We seek anomalies. We fed Numa with a complete model of our solar system. We rewound time to that temporal window we defined between 7 BC and 4 BC, the final period of Herod's reign. The question was only one: what happened in the sky of the Middle East at that time? What could be so unusual that it would make a group of elite intellectuals drop everything and begin a very dangerous journey? Initial suspicion falls on a comet. It is the most popular version. Chinese astronomers recorded a broom star in 5 BC. The date fits. However, the cultural code is a problem. The Magi were astrologers, and in ancient astrology, comets were a terrible omen. They announced the death of kings, plagues, and wars. No one saw a sign of misfortune and went out to give gifts. The comet hypothesis is psychologically incoherent. Another possibility would be a supernova, the explosion of a star, a burst of light strong enough to be seen by day. Yet, like the comet, a supernova is just a lamp that turned on in the sky. For professional astrologers, a meaningful message was needed that could be translated as, "A king is born in Judea, and he is more important than all the others." Numa's analysis reveals a third, much more likely hypothesis. It was not a star, but a planetary ballet. In 7 BC, a unique astronomical drama unfolded, starring Jupiter and Saturn in the constellation of Pisces. For Babylonian astrologers, each element had a precise meaning. Jupiter was the royal star, the symbol of supreme power. Saturn, in turn, was considered the protective planet of the Jewish people, and the constellation of Pisces was associated with the region of Palestine. Together, these pieces formed a clear message. It said that the king of the people of Judea was born in the land of Palestine. This is no longer just a flash, it is a telegram with an address and a title. But the event was even more special. Due to celestial mechanics, Jupiter and Saturn approached each other in the sky not once, but 3 times throughout that year. It all began in May with the initial signal. The Magi began their calculations and preparations. Months later, in September, the message was confirmed with full force. The Magi were already on their way. Finally, in December, the mystery of the star that stopped is resolved. Matthew writes that the star stopped over the place where the child was. Can a planet stop? Yes. At the moment, a planet viewed from Earth changes its apparent direction of motion. It appears to remain stationary for a few days. It is an effect called planetary stationing. In December 7th BC, Jupiter entered its stationary phase. To an observer on the ground, it indeed stopped, and if the Magi were traveling from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, a southward journey, the planet would be stationary on the southern horizon, exactly in the direction of the small town. Pure orbital mechanics, interpreted as a miracle. This also explains another strange detail. When the Magi arrive in Jerusalem and ask Herod about the new king, no one in the city knows what they are talking about. If a supernova were tearing through the sky, everyone would have seen it. But the text says Herod had to call them in secret to find out the exact time the star appeared. This fits the conjunction theory. For the average citizen, they were just two nearby bright dots. Only for the experts was it a cosmic headline. The star was not a beacon, it was a code. The sky sent its signal. To answer this call, looking up was not enough. It would be necessary to cross deserts and mountains, face dangers and the fury of a king. It would be required to embark on a journey that, according to Numa's calculations, challenged survival itself. We know the image, a man leading a donkey upon which travels a pregnant woman, walking through peaceful hills under a soft sunset. It is one of the most peaceful and iconic scenes of Christmas. Numa ignores the poetry and focuses on physics, geography, and biology. We entered the parameters of this journey into the system. The route from Nazareth to Bethlehem, a 9-month pregnancy, the terrain of Judea and first-century logistics. The result of the simulation is shocking. What we imagine as a romantic walk was in fact a march for survival, a high-risk expedition with less than a 50% chance of a happy ending. The first brutal obstacle was the distance. There is no straight line between Nazareth in Galilee and Bethlehem in Judea. Numa calculated 2 possible routes. The shortest route through Samaria was a war zone, about 120 kilometers. The problem is that in the 1st century, the relationship between Jews and Samaritans was one of open hostility, a conflict that could flare up at any moment. The historian Flavius Josephus reports attacks and murders of Jewish pilgrims in Samaritan territory. Attempting to cross Samaria with a pregnant wife would be an act of madness. The alternative, much longer, required descending to the Jordan River Valley, following the east bank, and then climbing the mountains of Judea toward Jerusalem and Bethlehem, a trek of at least 150 kilometers. For a healthy man, it would be 5 days of walking. However, the group's speed was dictated by its slowest member, a woman in the final stage of pregnancy. Physiological analysis shows that the shifted center of gravity, swelling, and pain would limit the pace to a few kilometers per hour with constant stops. The actual travel time rises to 10, perhaps 12 days. 2 weeks on the road, sleeping in the open or in filthy caravanserais. And as for the donkey, in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, there is no mention of a donkey. It only appears centuries later in other texts, but let's assume it existed. Numa simulated the physical impact of the journey on the woman. A donkey is not a car with air suspension. Every step is a dry jolt, a vibration transmitted through the spine. For a woman about to give birth, this constant jarring would be torture and a direct risk of premature labor. Riding was dangerous. Going on foot was exhausting. The final stretch was the worst, the ascent from Jericho, which is below sea level, to Bethlehem in the mountains. An elevation gain of over 1,000 meters in just 30 kilometers, climbing through a rocky desert. For a pregnant woman, this climb was an inhuman test of endurance. The fact that she reached her destination without giving birth on the side of the road is extraordinary in itself. Why? Why subject oneself to such risk? Luke says it was because of the census. We have already seen that Quirinius's census does not match the dates. And even if there were some local record, Roman bureaucracy was not irrational. The law required the head of the family to present himself. Joseph could have gone alone, so why did she go? The artificial intelligence suggests a much more human reason, based on social analysis of the time. Mary became pregnant before marriage. In a small village like Nazareth, where everyone knows everyone, this was a scandal, a mark of shame. The trip may have been an escape, a way for Joseph to protect Mary and the child from stares and whispers so that the birth could occur far from malicious tongues. Another possibility is economic. The Greek word for Joseph's profession, tekton, means more than just carpenter. It can mean builder or stonemason. Perhaps he had properties or an inheritance in Bethlehem, the land of his ancestors, and the trip was not for a census but a permanent move. Exhausted, they arrive in Bethlehem. At this point, we encounter another myth, the idea that there was no room at the inn. The Greek word used by Luke is kataluma. In the same gospel, Jesus uses the same word to refer to the guest room where he would celebrate Passover. It was not a hotel, it was the guest room in a relative's house. The reconstruction of a typical Judean house shows that the living area was on an upper level, while the lower level, sometimes an attached cave, was used to shelter animals during the night, so their heat would warm the house. The reality is that they reached the family home, but the kataluma, the guest room, was already full. It was not a story about the cruelty of the residents, but about poverty and overcrowding. They were offered the only space available, the service area of the house, along with the animals. It was warm and had straw. There, in the semi-darkness, amidst the smell of animals and smoke, the boy was born. The child was wrapped in cloths and placed in the manger, the stone trough where the animals ate, simply because there was no crib. The setting was one of pure vulnerability, a brutal journey, a dangerous birth in precarious conditions. But Numa detected something even stranger in the archaeological data of the site. What if this entire journey south was a miscalculation based on a misinterpreted prophecy? What if the city they were looking for, another place with the same name, was just a short and safe walk from home? When searching for the location of Bethlehem on any map, satellites guide us to a single city south of Jerusalem. Millions of pilgrims visit the Church of the Nativity, descend into a grotto, and touch a silver star on the floor, believing they are at ground zero of history. To them, geography is sacred and immutable. However, for a cold analysis, there is no sanctity, only coordinates, archaeological layers and probabilities. And this forces us to ask a question that seems absurd. In which Bethlehem was Jesus actually born? Most people don't even know that this question makes sense. In ancient Palestine, there were two cities with the same name. The first is the famous Bethlehem Ephrata in Judea, 8 kilometers from Jerusalem, the city of King David. The second is Bethlehem of Galilee, located in the north, a mere 10 kilometers from Nazareth, the home of Joseph and Mary. This changes everything. The 150-kilometer journey, a brutal march, turns into a 3-hour walk over flat, familiar terrain. Human logic screams, why choose the impossible path when the destination with the same name is practically in your backyard? A comparative analysis of archaeological data from both sites puts the official version in check. Bethlehem of Judea, the famous city, has been excavated countless times. And what did archaeologists find in the level corresponding to the 1st century, the era of Herod? A vacuum of information. The archaeological layer of that period is practically non-existent. There are almost no coins from the era, nor fragments of domestic pottery. It's as if the site were an empty field, or at best, the ruins of an ancient settlement with a few shepherd huts. There was no city there, The focus of the investigation turns north, to Bethlehem of Galilee. Excavations there reveal a completely different scenario. A prosperous first-century settlement with houses, a synagogue, and oil presses. Life there was active, and the most intriguing discovery is that centuries later, a huge church and a Christian monastery were built on that site. Why build a monumental religious complex in an obscure Galilean village? The hypothesis is clear. The first Christians knew. They knew that the true birthplace was there. Only later, when theology needed to overlap with history, was the focus of pilgrimage shifted south so that everything would fit the prophecy. This leads us directly to the David factor. The prophecy of the prophet Micah was explicit. But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel. For the authors of the Gospels, it was vital to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, and by law, the Messiah had to be a descendant of David and born in the city of David. If Jesus had been born in Galilee, in the wrong place, he would be seen as an impostor. Therefore, the narrative obligatorily had to move him south. The census was the literary mechanism to justify this journey. Geography was redrawn to serve theology. However, there is an even deeper layer. Near Bethlehem of Judea, there was a place called Migdal Eder, the Tower of the Flock. Ancient Jewish texts said that the Messiah would be revealed there. And what was this tower? It was the place where very special flocks grazed, the lambs destined for sacrifices in the Temple of Jerusalem. The shepherds who cared for these flocks were almost like priests. There was a rigorous procedure. When a sacrificial lamb was born, it was immediately wrapped in cloth so as not to be injured and placed in a clean manger. Look at the Christmas story through this lens. A baby wrapped in cloths, lying in a manger, and the first to receive the news are the shepherds of the temple flocks. For anyone of that time, the image was instantaneous and powerful. Not just a king was born, but the Lamb of God, the one who would be offered in sacrifice. This theological metaphor was so strong that the evangelists needed to link the birth to Bethlehem of Judea. Even if historically the event occurred in Galilee, spiritual truth demanded the southern setting. The location is defined whether by history or prophecy, but the setting alone does not make the story. The characters who transformed a rural birth into an international crisis are missing. The mysterious visitors who came from the east are missing. If you walk into any store at Christmas time, you will find them. 3 figures in luxurious robes riding camels, following a star. Tradition gave them names, Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar, and turned them into kings from distant lands. It is the most peaceful and international part of the nativity scene. But the analysis of Matthew's original text, crossed with the geopolitical map of the first century, reveals a much more tense and dangerous truth. Historical facts show another reality. The original text does not say there were 3. It only mentions 3 types of gifts. The givers could have been 10 or 50. The text does not say they were kings, and their names only appeared 800 years later. Matthew uses a specific Greek word, magoi, magi, and they were not fairy tale magicians. The word leads us straight to ancient Persia, where the magoi formed the caste of Zoroastrian priests. They were the intellectual and religious elite of the Parthian Empire, the superpower that rivaled Rome. More than that, they were part of the council that had the power to elect and depose kings. The Magi were kingmakers. The scene at the end of the 1st century BC was one of absolute tension. The world was divided. On one side, the Roman Empire. On the other, the Parthian Empire, the only nation Rome never managed to conquer. Between them, a tense containment zone that included Judea. The relationship between the 2 empires was a conflict ready to explode. Herod, The king of Judea was a vassal of Rome, a watchdog on the eastern border, and lived in a state of constant paranoia regarding the Parthian threat. In this explosive scenario, the Magi from the east arrive. A small caravan of scholars with bags of gold would not have survived even 10 kilometers. A delegation of this level traveled with a heavy military escort. It wasn't a nativity scene, it was an incursion, a formal Parthian delegation with dozens, perhaps hundreds of horsemen arriving at the gates of Jerusalem. This is why Matthew writes a phrase we usually ignore. King Herod was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. The city was not marveling. It was panicking because a Parthian army was at its gate. People thought the war had begun. The Magi enter the city and ask the most provocative question possible directly to Herod. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? Herod also used that title, but he had bought it from Rome. He was not of the royal lineage. The Parthians' question was a diplomatic slap, a declaration that they did not recognize Herod's legitimacy and were there to support the true heir. It was direct interference in local politics, backed by an enemy superpower. Herod, a psychopath but not a fool, could not simply execute them and start a war he could not win. He played the game of diplomacy, asking them to let him know when they found the child so that he too could worship him, a euphemism for a dagger strike. The Magi find the family and deliver their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Tradition interprets them as symbols, but in practice they were capital. Frankincense and myrrh were aromatic resins that in antiquity were worth more than gold. They were used as medicines and were a strong convertible currency. The Magi did not give trinkets. They provided the funding for an escape operation. They provided the resources for the family to survive as refugees in Egypt. Furthermore, the act of gifting a claimant to the throne on foreign soil was a formal recognition of his sovereignty. Parthia had made its bet. Then they simply disappear. Warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they retreated to their land by another route. This was not a casual detour, it was a planned infiltration, with Herod's spies everywhere. Disappearing with an entire delegation required a level of elite military intelligence and planning. They humiliated Herod in his own territory. The furious despot realizes he has been deceived, and his anger mixes with fear. Somewhere near his capital grows a boy with the seal of approval from the Parthian Empire, a political threat he cannot ignore. And a humiliated and cornered tyrant is the most dangerous thing in the world. The Christmas story has a dark chapter, a passage that most songs and cards prefer to ignore. After the Magi deceive the king, he, blinded by fury, orders his soldiers to kill all the boys in Bethlehem under 2 years old. It is a scene of absolute terror. For many, this is where history becomes legend. The skeptic's argument is strong. How could a massacre of children, however small, not be recorded by any historian of the time, especially by Flavius Josephus, who hated Herod and documented his crimes in detail? But the absence of a body in a criminal trial does not prove the defendant's innocence. To understand the massacre, it is necessary to face the profile of the main suspect, Herod the Great. He was not just a simple tyrant, he was an administrative genius and one of the greatest builders of antiquity. He razed cities, ports, and fortresses, and rebuilt the Temple of Jerusalem on a magnificent scale. But beneath the genius lived a monster fed by a deep inferiority complex. Herod was not a Jew of noble blood. He was an Idumean, a descendant of a people forced to convert. He knew that the religious elite of Jerusalem despised him, seeing him as a foreign usurper on David's throne. This insecurity transformed into a sickly paranoia, obsessed with eliminating anyone who could remotely threaten his power. The list of his victims is a family record of horror. He ordered his young brother-in-law, Aristobulus, to be accidentally drowned in a pool because the boy was too popular. He executed his wife's grandfather, the old Hyrcanus, for a forged conspiracy. He condemned his own wife, Mariamne, the woman he loved madly, to death, consumed by pathological jealousy. After killing her, they say he went mad with grief, wandering the palace and calling her name. However, the most terrifying thing was what he did to his own children. He executed 3 of them. Alexander and Aristobulus, his sons with Mariamne, were strangled on charges of treason. Antipater, his firstborn, was killed just 5 days before Herod's own death. The news of his cruelty reached Rome, where Emperor Augustus uttered a famous phrase, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." A pig he would not kill out of respect for Jewish laws, a son he would not hesitate to kill. Added to this mental instability was unbearable physical agony. At the end of his life, at the exact time of these events, Herod was rotting alive. Reports describe a terrible disease, likely a combination of kidney failure and a gangrenous infection. He suffered from constant, agonizing pain. Chronic pain destroys the human psyche, annihilates empathy, and fuels aggression. Herod was not just a tyrant. He was a wounded animal attacking everything around him. The ultimate proof of his mental state is the plan he drew up for his own funeral. Knowing that no one would mourn him, he ordered the most noble men of Judea to be gathered in the hippodrome of Jericho. His instruction to his sister Salome was clear. The moment he died, the soldiers were to kill all the imprisoned nobles. Thus, he guaranteed there would be mourning throughout the country. The massacre did not happen, but the order was given. The answer becomes obvious. Would a man who killed the wife he loved, 3 of his sons, and who planned to execute the elite of his country to force national mourning hesitate to kill a few children in an insignificant village? For Herod, it was not a moral issue. It was damage control, the elimination of a political threat pointed out by a foreign power. And why didn't Flavius Josephus mention it? Because of the scale. Bethlehem was a village of 300, maybe 500 inhabitants. The number of boys under 2 would be at most 20. For a historian accustomed to narrating civil wars, sieges of cities, and mass crucifixions, the execution of a dozen children in a police operation in a rural area was a footnote, a routine occurrence in Herod's terror. And the family's flight to Egypt? The text speaks of an angel in a dream. Joseph, however, did not need a supernatural warning. He had just received in his house a foreign political delegation looking for a new king. He knew Herod's reputation. The dream was the logical conclusion of an intelligent man realizing his family was in the crosshairs of a madman. Fleeing to Egypt, out of the king's jurisdiction, was the only possible move. They escaped the tyrant's sword, but their story began with a word, a prophecy that, through a detail of translation, changed the world. The entire mystical structure of Christmas, the idea that differentiates it from any other story, rests on a single word: virgin. The concept of a birth without human intervention is the central miracle. And what if this miracle is, in fact, the result of an ancient translation difficulty, a choice made in a dusty library 300 years before the event? The evangelist Matthew, to prove the birth was the fulfillment of a prophecy, quotes the prophet Isaiah, "Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son." Matthew wrote in Greek, and the word he used was parthenos, which unequivocally means virgin. The problem is that Isaiah, 700 years earlier, wrote in Hebrew, and in the original text the word he used was not that. The word was Alma. In Hebrew, Alma means a young woman of marriageable age. The word describes age and social status, not necessarily a physiological condition. To refer to a virgin in the medical sense, Hebrew has a specific and precise word, betula. If Isaiah wanted to emphasize a miraculous birth, he would have used betula, but he did not. In his original context, he was giving a political sign to a terrified king, that Alma, that young woman, would have a son, and before the boy grew up, the king's enemies would have disappeared. How did a young woman become a virgin? The change happened in Egypt, in the 3rd century BC, during the translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek. The translators, encountering the word Alma, did not have a perfect Greek equivalent. They made a choice. They reasoned that a young, unmarried woman in a decent society should be a virgin and used the word Parthenos. That small decision by an anonymous translator would become the foundation of a global theology 300 years later. Matthew read the Greek version and saw the prophecy fit perfectly. Of course, there is another way to see this. Perhaps it was not an error, but providence, history shaping itself to reveal a deeper meaning. Or from a more cynical and human perspective, perhaps Mary became pregnant before marriage, a crime punishable by death. Presenting the pregnancy as the fulfillment of a prophecy, even one based on an imperfect translation, would be the only way to protect her life and the child's. Linguistics leaves us at a crossroads. Science, however, can give us one last clue, one that redefines the date of the story. Luke says that on the night of the birth, there were shepherds in the field, keeping watch over their flock by night. We have grown accustomed to imagining this scene under snow in the cold of December, but the climatology of Judea makes this impossible. Bethlehem is in a mountainous region. In December, the nights are freezing, rainy, and sometimes it snows. No shepherd would leave his flock in the open under those conditions. The animals were kept in shelters. Shepherds only slept in the fields with their flocks at 2 times of the year, in the spring, during the lambing season, or in the autumn after the harvest, when the weather was still mild. And autumn fits perfectly. The second conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, the great sign in the sky, occurred in September. This time coincides with the Jewish festival of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles. During Sukkot, pilgrims from all over the country crowded Jerusalem and its surroundings, which explains perfectly why there was no room in the guest room. We clear the screen, and what we see now is sharper, more real, and in a way more impressive than the legend. Look at the complete scenario. A rare planetary alignment that happens once every 800 years occurs exactly when Jewish prophecies reach their boiling point. A delegation from Rome's enemy superpower risks a war to recognize a claimant to the throne in a vassal kingdom. The local king, one of history's most paranoid and efficient tyrants, is in his last and most painful months of life, making him volatile and dangerous. And a humble family finds itself at the epicenter of all this. What is the probability of astronomy, geopolitics, the psychology of a tyrant, and the theology of a people converging at a single point in space and time by mere chance? The probability is near zero. This is what can be called a unique moment in history, an event so complex it could not be invented. The real story is not about angels singing on a snowy night. It is about the courage of a refugee family, the precision of celestial mechanics, and the brutal machinations of power. The truth is harder, dirtier, and infinitely stronger than the nativity scene we keep in our memory. If you enjoyed this investigation, your subscription to the channel and any donation help us expand the Pneuma Project. We would love to read your reflection on the video subject in the comments and your suggestion for the next theme to be addressed. Tell us which city you are watching from. Thank you for your company until the end. M.